Yes, okay. Good morning and welcome everyone to this iWork North Carolina Virtual Speaker Series. The North Carolina Business Committee for Education and North Carolina Virtual Public School are proud to host the iWork North Carolina Virtual Speaker Series to include presentations about career paths by those working in the field. We feel that it's never too early to start thinking about your future, and thus we are providing a platform for our students to gain insight and exposure to potential career paths while still in middle and high school. And we are excited this morning to have Deb Brown join us to go behind the scenes with a middle school principal. She worked in the field of teaching for over 20 years as an award-winning educator in New York, Boston, and then came to Wake County, where she worked for 10 years. She has a master's degree from Syracuse University, summa cum laude. She has 5 North Carolina licenses in English education, speech communication, theater arts, and school administration. She was on the founding team for the Research Triangle High School, one of the very first flipped high schools in the nation. In 2019, she joined the Exploris School, which is a school that emphasizes social and environmental justice, as well as experiential and relationship-based education. She's the principal of that K-8 school. Her specialties include project-based learning, personalized learning, digital teaching and learning, as well as teacher effectiveness. Her passion is helping teachers grow and reach every single student. And we are thrilled to have her share her experience and expertise with us this morning.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So first, I'd like for you to tell us what your school looks like. What does experiential and relationship-based education look like for the students?
Yeah, so Exploris is a really fascinating program. So it's one of the oldest independent public charter schools in North Carolina. So we've been open for over 20 years now. And we have a project-based focus, which means that the kids are always up and doing. The students themselves form essential questions about the world and their community with the goal for our vision, which is that we want to give kids the skills to be able to go out and make positive changes in the world. And so they start looking at what are the issues in their community, what are the issues that they face in their school, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in the state, in the nation overall, and then think about how they can start to be change makers. We take those things and then we start on top of that layering what the standards are. So for example, one of the projects that the students were working on was looking at the history of racial equity in Wake County. And as part of that process, they were interviewing a family that was one of the first families that tried to integrate the public schools. The student was growing up literally across the street from an elementary school that he was not allowed to attend because he was an African-American boy and the schools were not integrated, and his school was a separate building along the way. The students decided they wanted to name a school after him, after this family. So this is Joseph Holt. And as part of that, they're learning the history standards, they're learning the government standards, they're learning the communication standards, writing, argumentation. They're looking at the statistics behind all of this, so the math skills get integrated. So the whole program is based on this idea of building projects that the kids are literally going out and making change. And this can be as small as our kindergarten team, where the students were saying, what can we do to make people be happy? You know, we want to make people be happier. And we partnered with a local community organization, A Place at the Table, which provides free and low-cost meals for families in downtown Raleigh. And they, the kindergarten students designed the paper sleeves that go on, you know, if you get a cup of coffee, it has the sleeve on it, and they drew pictures on it. So for a couple of months, if you went there at A Place at the Table and got a cup of coffee, it came with a hand-decorated pictures and messages from a kindergartner at the Exploris School. So it's that combination of teaching those rigorous academic standards, but doing it in service to a need that you see in the community. And so that keeping everything that hands-on experiential program. We use a lot of the design for change process, which begins with that empathy piece, with learning how the other side feels, learning perspectives. So that brings in those social emotional skills as well when we talk about those experiential learning projects.
That's really fascinating. Sounds like an exciting place to be.
It is. It's a fantastic program with some really great people.
And Crystal is mentioning in the chat that she loves the service component with that. And so you spoke about the social justice piece, but what about the environmental piece? What do the
Sure.
students do with that?
So it starts as small as just having the connections to nature. So our kids tend to be out of the building a lot. We consider the whole downtown area our classrooms. So even if they're not able to go, and we do lots of smaller field trips and things that do get them out and connected. So it might be a stream study. It actually starts when you get your first supply list, because the supply list mentioned things like a really good rugged poncho, which is not something you usually see in a back to school list because the kids are going to be outdoors. We work on a waste-free lunch. So we really encourage kids not to use like disposable plastic baggies when they bring things in and disposable silverware, but to have containers that can be washed and reused and going back. So that building that idea of what is my footprint in the world, and that idea of justice. Then it gets into much bigger projects. The eighth grade, for example, does a big question that starts the essential question of where's our water come from? What is water? And they end up interviewing the city engineers. They look at the social justice issues around water and access to water. They read books that talk about different cultures. There's a great story that's called A Long Walk to Water that talks about a kid in an African village and how they have to walk every day to get their water, as opposed to us, which tend to get, turning on the faucet and the taps. So the environmental justice really goes to, how we're running the school. We're working on keeping it as green as possible. We've won several awards for keeping our energy use as small and teaching kids that impact, but also looking at those environmental issues from a curriculum lens.
Wow, amazing.
Mhm.
Really exciting. I hope more schools will go in those directions. So I see that you have a variety of interest with all of the different North Carolina licenses you have. So what specifically led you into the field of education and into this focus of theater arts and English education?
Well, it really started, I mean, like a lot of teachers will tell you, it starts with stories where I would line up all of my stuffed animals and teach them lessons and play school a lot. But I was a reader. I loved reading books. I was passionate about books. When I was growing up in New York, we lived in a little town in way in upstate New York, and we were really far out of the main town center. But the one thing that I could get to by walking or on my bike was the local community theater. So I spent a lot of time in the summers and after schools working backstage, being on stage any chance I could get, and working with theater. So that idea of theater and books really brought me into a career that was based in English. So in New York, there isn't like usually a separate theater program. It's usually housed in the English department. So I was an English teacher. I taught theater classes. I ran a drama program, coached a speech and debate team, which is all those presentation skills. Things come into that. And was a classroom teacher, was teaching classes up until really 2 or 3 years ago. I always had a class that I was working with, and then gradually moved into more leadership positions. So, but it was really that love of reading and that love of working with theater that got me into wanting to share that and teach that and live with that every day.
So did you begin at the middle school level or the high school level with
So when I
teaching?
was teaching, I had kind of split between. So I spent probably more time in high schools, but I did spend 5 years in a phenomenal middle school program that had many of the same approaches that I see in Exploris. So it was a teen taught program, had a huge outdoor education unit. We would take the entire team for a week out to a local campground, and every night a different homeroom would spend the night. And during the day, they were doing orienteering, and they were looking for animal evidence, and they were looking at, there was a big Native American history center there, and they would spend time studying that. So again, that idea of how you integrate outdoor education, environmental education into a curricular program. And then also spent a lot of time in high school, so a little bit between. I think I probably like teaching the high school level better, just because I like the literature better at that level. I like the more in-depth contents that are really meaty that you got to dig into. But from an administrative level, I really love the middle schoolers. It's just a really special time. They're still very much kids. They get very excited, enthusiastic about things, but there's a lot of time still to shape pathways. So if they're getting into behaviors and self-talk and things and interactions that are not healthy, there's a lot of time still to change that. And they're very receptive to it still, usually.
So that kind of leads me into my next question, which you've kind of already touched on, but what do you enjoy most about serving as the principal of the Exploris School?
Oh, wow, yeah. So, I think the thing that got me more into the administration and leadership side was this ability to see the impact of a whole system. When you're a classroom teacher, you've got this great relationship with your class and the curriculum that you're teaching and the books and that excitement, but it can be kind of lonely, right? You close your door, you teach your class, and it's you and the kids. Um, and then I got much more interested in looking at how these systems all fit together. What happens to my kids when they leave my classroom? How does the whole program of what we're doing as a school work? And so I began looking at more. I was a department chair, and then I was interested in helping teachers be even better at what they do. And so I was working with a lot of professional development programs. So working now with Exploris and getting to see this amazing program in action. I think working with so many creative people with such great experiences. We have an amazing supportive community. So our parents are very flexible. Um, we like to say we have an adjective, we call it Exploracy. The things that are Exploracy, they are ready to make a change, they're reflective, they're creative, they're innovative. And the job is never the same any 2 days in a row. So if you're somebody who doesn't like to be bored, doesn't like repetition, school teaching and certainly administration may be a great career path for you. But I really love the creativity of the people I work with. I like the opportunities to problem solve. So you get to do a lot of here's an issue. Let's look at all these different perspectives. Let's look at some solutions, and then that reflective piece. You know, what is what we're doing working? How can we be better at this? Listening to different ideas and different perspectives, and always being in that evaluative position to say, are we seeing results? Are we seeing growth with this approach? And if not, let's get creative and go back and try something different.
So, speaking of those challenges, what about in today's time with COVID? What particular challenges have you found, and how is Explorer School trying to solve them?
Sure. So, I mean, like the rest of the world, we shut down in March and went to an online program. One of the things about being a charter school and being a smaller independent school is we can make decisions very quickly, and we can make decisions that are best for our smaller community. I feel sorry, I shouldn't say feel sorry, but I empathize and recognize that the county schools have so many schools and differences and people that they have to make decisions for. It's a little easier with us because our community is small and very supportive and very trusting. So we took a couple days to work with the teachers on what is effective digital teaching and learning environments. And this is where some of my background really came in handy. I'd spent a lot of time with digital teaching and with programs that worked with personalized learning and playlists and the concept of using all of the different tech tools that are out there, everything from Zoom platforms, Google Classrooms, Flipgrid, all those things that everyone knows really well now. And I had actually only been at Exploris since that past summer. So I hadn't, come in with a ton of let's do all of this new stuff, because what they have is a really fabulous program and what we do works really well. But it was nice to be in that position where I could take some of the experiences that I'd had before and help teachers very quickly look at what are the hallmarks of an effective digital program. What does really good asynchronous teaching looks like? What does really good, online teaching look like? How much screen time should kids be spending? What are ways that we can keep them involved and connected? So we did the pivot like everyone else. We were really careful to keep our focus on the social and emotional side of learning. Our number one goal, as I told my staff when we went out, that their first job was to keep them connected. I wanted them to keep them connected to each other, keep them connected to the teacher in the school, and keep them connected to learning. That I still wanted them to have this curiosity, this discovery, the investigation, the struggle with learning something new. So we still wanted to see some of that pathway going. We beefed up our counseling team and really brought in more of that to make sure, again, that we were reaching out to kids who might be feeling isolated, to home situations that might be exacerbated by everyone being home in the same household all the time. and just support our teachers who were also worried about illness in their own family, who were struggling with childcare, who were, nervous about being, as I said, they started with saying things like, I know I'm a really good teacher. And then suddenly in this environment, I'm terrible. Like, I feel like I'm not getting to the kids. I'm not doing what I need to do. Like it really changed their whole perception of themselves. And so part of my job was to help them see that, yes, we were struggling. And yes, everyone was basically a first year teacher again, and that we were going to use our values as a school, which included this innovation and reflection, to guide our whole pathway and say, we're going to try something, we're going to look at it. If it doesn't work, we're going to go back. So we made a number of changes to our program going into the fall. We have made the decision as Exploris, we have stayed digital throughout the fall. With a few exceptions, we've brought in what we call our C+ activities. So we're not quite we're fully Plan C or fully Plan B, but we've brought in small groups for more support, or teams have met, like that outdoor focus, have met outside for hikes, or for a stream study at Walnut Creek, they were still able to go and do that and be outside and socially distanced. So trying to find the aspects of our program that still make Exploris, and how does that translate to digital? Some of the challenges have been threading that needle between the kids' needs to be together and to have that social interaction, parents and families who really want the kids back to school, and the danger of this virus. We know this is still a dangerous, highly contagious, and sometimes, unfortunately, deadly, or certainly long-term consequence virus. And even if we felt that we could keep kids safe, can we protect our staff as well? And that sometimes has meant some very difficult conversations. And what we decided on was on transparency. We developed a really strong metric so people could see that we weren't just letting emotions guide our decisions. We were looking at very specific things that we wanted to hit in terms of school readiness, the community spread, our own ability to keep people protected. And then, once we get those into the green area, then we can look at a more regular schedule of in-person learning. So that's been some of the challenges through this, is, preparing the teachers and supporting them, listening to the family's concerns and finding ways to address the family's concerns, and then communication and transparency with the community, with our community.
That's amazing. I admire your decisions there. I know it probably has not been easy.
No.
So what about with just coming into, as you mentioned the previous summer, into the Exploris School, what were some of the surprises within that particular job that you discovered?
I think some of the biggest surprises, and maybe some of the things that all of the administration prep programs and things don't really prepare you for, is how much of a background would have really been helpful in finances and understanding. We're also working on building a new building. So suddenly we're in the middle of legal conversations and architecture conversations and commercial bond rates and applying for grants and all of that. And I had a basic understanding of that. I had run budgets before for instructional supplies and things, but looking at the complexities of keeping the finances together, particularly, again, with all of these changes that have happened this past year, and all of the reporting requirements. So there's lots of, anytime you get money from the state very rightfully wants to know what you did with that money. So making sure that you're tracking all of that, doing all the reports. Exploris reports to the Office of Charter Schools, which is part of the Department of Public Instruction. So that's our direct report, but we have a number of things that we're responsible for, always keeping up with. So I think that might have been one of the surprises, is just how much of my time would be spent. And part of that, again, is because we are in the middle of a new facilities campaign. But yeah, so that was I think we go into teaching, wanting to work with kids and wanting to work with teachers. And if you're going into administration, this is the behind the scenes part. There's a lot of understanding those legal complexities, the financial complexities that also go into the day-to-day maintenance of keeping a school up and running.
So that kind of leads me into your education and your training to go into not only teaching, but also into administration, that students would be interested to know.
Sure. So I think if you're interested in teaching, I mean, the number one piece of advice I would have is spend a lot of time in classrooms. So go into, ask the teacher if you've got a free period, if you can go sit in the class, teach some things here and there until you've actually planned a lesson, tried to deliver it to students, watch the feedback to see if it was effective or not. You don't really have a pretty good understanding of that. Do some shadowing. Ask if you can follow one of your assistant principals for the day. Ask if you can sit in on a budget meeting or sit in on a department meeting. A lot of times the people and the educators will be very open to that. They're very interested in that. If your school has some kind of a club that gets you ready, a future teachers type thing, that's a great place to get some of those resources, or maybe see if there's a teacher who would be willing to sponsor that. When you get into school, an education prep program is great. One of the things that I really liked about my education in New York is a lot of the New York schools require that you actually have a full major in your content area and you do the education pedagogical component. So having that deep knowledge of your own curriculum is really helpful as a classroom teacher. Some education programs will do like a little bit of this, like you have a little bit of your content program and then a little bit of the teaching piece. But I found that I was in a much better position to start as a teacher, having that strong foundation in my own content. With administration, the requirements are usually certification, and that's often on top of a bachelor and master's degree program. Sometimes you can do those at the same time, depending on the program that you're choosing. And that will set you up with a lot of the historical aspects of schools, some of the legal sides of things that administrators are responsible for, looking at school systems, case studies, problem solving through those bits. And so if you're a student looking to get into this, I would really recommend getting into schools as quickly as possible. I know when I was in my master's degree program, I actually went and observed another fellow student who was teaching, and they were also in their master's degree, and it was the first time that they had actually taught a lesson in a classroom. So they'd done their whole undergraduate program, and then they're doing their whole master's program, and they hadn't even done any student teaching. And she got done with her first week of teaching and said, I hate every minute of this. I really don't like this. And now she had a master's in something that she wasn't even going to use. She ditched the whole thing and went into radio communication and broadcasting, which was a great choice for her. So my advice is really to get into classrooms soon. Try it out, find those opportunities, build your networks. And that'll really give you a good sense of what the job looks like and if it's a good fit for you.
That's great advice. Crystal just put in the chat, oh no, for your friend there in the master's program. What about when you are interviewing potential teachers or potential assistant administrators? What are you looking for? What type of skills with the interview?
Sure. So we start with a fairly rigorous process where we have a kind of build our portrait of an ideal candidate. So here are the things that we're looking for before we've met the people. And then we know that no one person is going to fit perfectly into that outline that we create, but we look for the best. We use it as a metaphor, but we look for the best fit, right? So who's going to be the best fit in that? So for Exploris in particular, we are looking for that creativity. We are looking for people who can think differently about the way that they're presenting information. We definitely look for that relationship spark. We want someone who can connect with students, who can engage with students. And this would go for anyone in the building, no matter what position you were working in. If you're working with students or families, if you're working at the front desk, if you're working in administration, or if you're teaching and being a classroom teacher. We really want that ability to connect with kids. We do look for quality in their background. So we want to see evidence of that they've, if possible, that they've done this job before, that they've done it well. And if they haven't done this job before, what are the things from their background that will show us that they can bring those skills and attributes into that position? So that strong background in content, that strong understanding of how to motivate and engage young students, and that ability again to really be reflective. So can you look at, no teacher is perfect all the time, no administrator is perfect all the time, but it's, can you always be a lifelong learner as well? Can you look at a lesson that you taught and say, here's where it worked, here's the kids I didn't reach, what am I going to do to reach those kids? Can I look back as a principal and say, here's a decision I made that may not have been the best choice at the time, what did I do to make that decision, and how could I improve on that process and make a better choice for the next time? So it's always bringing in that reflective piece.
So that kind of goes into my next question. I know part of your passion is helping teachers so that they can reach every student. What does that look like with mentoring teachers and helping sort of coach them and guide them in that way?
Sure. Well, it starts with we throw around the concept of professional development and professional learning a lot. I think if you talk to most teachers, they'll tell you that probably 80 to 90% of the PD they've experienced has never been particularly effective. We often take this real scattershot approach where we'll bring in an expert for a day who describes this great thing and everyone's really excited, and then they go back to their classroom and it just kind of filters out or it doesn't work for them. I think professional learning and growth is something that each teacher needs to personalize. So we start with a significant amount of goal setting for the teacher, where again, that reflective piece, what are the things that you need to improve? What's your personal goals for the year? And then looking at how can we provide support for you to reach that goal? So sometimes it might be a teacher who's looking at getting a higher degree. It might be a teacher who really wants to improve something as simple as their questioning techniques, right? So how can we provide that support? That might be going into the classroom and observing. It might be hooking them up with another teacher to observe and to work with so they can see how that works for them, providing them with that time. And then we also have some whole school goals. So we have some overarching things as a school that we want to get better at. And then we do provide some whole group instruction for our teachers as well to look at those issues and find ways to tackle those. We've been partnered for the last couple of years with Peaceful Schools and looking at having a restorative approach to our disciplinary techniques, the idea of the responsive classroom, which means that you don't start looking at, you know, Jonathan throws a marker across the room at Adelaide, and hits Adelaide, and Adelaide's crying, and Jonathan's like, "What? I didn't do anything." Instead of taking the one kid out and punishing them for that, said, you're not supposed to throw markers. It's this idea of you're a community, so not so much the what did you do, but what was going through your mind. Like, why did you decide to throw a marker at that particular point? And you're part of a community. You have now damaged this community. How can you restore? That's that restorative piece. How can you restore the community again? What do you need to do to repair any harm that was done? And that might be an apology that's sincere, not just the sorry. Or it might be looking at what was going through your mind at that point that you were throwing the markers. Were you bored? Were you mad? Were you stressed? And then maybe finding a different way to cope with it the next time. So we've done a lot of training with our whole staff on those kinds of techniques and practices.
Sounds very similar to maybe a Montessori approach in
It
the
brings in some of those aspects, yes, very much. And again, that idea of being in community with people and using like circle discussions to talk about that. Because, even that situation I gave, when one kid in a room has done something that's harmed another kid, the students who are watching are also affected, right? That creates feelings of stress in them. And so, looking at how do the little things that we do impact our whole classroom um, is often a good way to approach that.
And speaking of relationships, as you've gone through your career as an educator, did you seek networking opportunities, particularly as you moved into administration? And what would that look like for students wanting to seek out those
Yeah.
networking opportunities and mentors?
Yeah, I think networking sometimes gets kind of a bad rap, and you picture something like Mad Men with people sort of artificially saying, let's do lunch, kind of thing. But really building your network is a matter of finding other people who are doing the things that you're interested in doing. And that can start, if you're a student right now doing that, I mentioned already like job shadowing, that could start with that kind of opportunity. If there's a chance to visit other schools or other types of schools to go and look at those different kinds of programs. Um, it might be as simple as using social media. Find some people on Twitter whose approaches that you like and start following those people, participating in Twitter chats. If there are local presentations or workshops that are happening, go to those, stay for the question and answer piece, ask lots of questions, find out who those people are. Again, follow them on social media and keep up with what they're doing. And that can just be a great way to start building that. So even if you're not really comfortable just going up to people in random social situations and saying, hi, tell me about your job, or handing out your business cards. You can still, just from behind your screen, start to look at these networks of educators who are doing the kind of work that you're interested in doing and keeping up with with what they're doing.
Great advice. I'm just sort of interested. You worked in Boston and New York, and then moved to North Carolina. What brought you here?
Family. Yeah, it was mostly family. So my dad was military, so we were kind of, I was the classic Air Force brat, and we moved quite a bit. And so I had been graduated from high school, went to school in New York, and had started my career there. My husband's job brought us to Boston for a couple of years, and meanwhile, I'd always had some family in Carolina. And then I watched more and more. My parents moved down, my uncles and aunts moved down, my sister moved down, and we were kind of the last holdout in Boston. And we finally decided that. Our kids were about 2 and 4 years old at the time, that trying to raise them without the family network was really difficult. We'd visited many times and had fallen in love with it. So it was 1999. We moved to a house in Cary and have been in the same house, and no, haven't looked back.
That's wonderful. That also brings me to another question. How do you really maintain that life-work balance?
Mm. It's really tough. And I've been doing this enough now. I'm in 30 years now in public education, and enough to see. I mentioned like the kids growing. There are definitely ups and downs and cycles, and times when your personal life is really occupying, much more of your brain, and other times when you have a lot more space to really work. I think it's one of the things that allowed me to go into administration. I'm not sure that I would have been as successful at this job if I were trying to do it with toddlers in the house so much with those schedules. I know people who do it and they do it really well, but I just know the way my own mental capacity was working and emotional levels, that being an administrator is very often a 24/7 job. I'll say things like my days can be easier than when I was teaching full time in the classroom. So, you're a classroom teacher, you've got those 5 or 6 classes you're going to be going to and responsible for, and papers to grade. I might have a day as a principal when I really don't have a lot of meetings on my plate, and I'm mostly walking the halls and observing casually, observing what's going on in the classrooms, doing walkthroughs, chatting with kids. But you have to be ready to get that call, and that call could be that something's wrong with the building. There's, something, we've had air conditioning issues, we've had fire issues, we've had, maintenance types of things that you have to immediately go and fix. It could be something's wrong with a kid. Something's happened with a staff member, and those can come in at, 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. And suddenly I'm talking to a 911 operator, or I'm on the phone with social services and looking at those things. So the work-life balance is really a matter of a lot of time management. So I work really hard on blocking in. I could kind of show you my calendar over here, but blocking in really specifically things. And if you're a Stephen Covey fan, Stephen Covey talks a lot about the big rocks. Like if you don't schedule in the big things that you definitely want to get done, it gets filled in with all the little stuff, and suddenly it doesn't happen. So if I know there's time that, like we're doing, especially since the shutdown, we do a family Zoom call. And that's kind of sacred time that's built into my schedule, that we've got family from all over the country that's going to be on. And that's an hour or two that I'm not going to take calls. I'm not going to do these other things. So you block that time out, that's your recharge time. Same thing with conversations with teachers. It gets very easy, or students. It gets very easy to be in that squeaky wheel gets the grease bit, where you're only working with the kids that show up in your office or get referred to you, and you're missing that chance, or a teacher who's struggling, you're missing that chance to really see what else is happening. So scheduling those times to do the walkthroughs, to do those, to make those and build those relationships. If you don't schedule your priorities, they're not priorities anymore, and everything else will become that priority.
That's great advice. And Crystal just said that as well, that, being intentional about that time
Yes.
with your family and friends is so important. So I wanted to come back to, you mentioned the Research Triangle High School being one of the first flipped high schools in the nation, and sort of what that looks like and how that works.
Yeah, that was an exciting time. So it was a very talented team of people who'd had experience working with opening Raleigh Charter High School and working with the Contemporary Science Center, which was a chance for kids to come and do basically an all-day field trip at a science lab. And the people who were working on that started saying, why isn't school like this all the time? Why aren't we doing more of this hands-on kinds of labs and experiments, and this, why is there so much emphasis on sitting and getting content? And so the concept came up to open a school that was built around, how do you create that time Well, one of the ways that you can create that time is to take, Maslow's hierarchy, or not Maslow, take the Bloom's taxonomy, that pyramid, and flip it. So you're doing those really lower level things like remembering, recalling. Those can be done by kids on their own time through like a video lesson. So if I want to teach a concept that's just something simple like a play has a 5 act structure. I can make a 5 to 10 minute video that shows some examples of that, that explains that concept. Kids can watch that whenever they want to watch that. I'm the teacher that goes home in their pocket, right? They carry me around, excuse me, they carry me around on their phone. They can start and stop, and they can get that on their own. So when they come to class, what they can be doing is acting out plays and writing their own plays. So it's that idea of flipping, where you take those low level skills that students can then do at their own pace, at their own time, independently. And when they come to class, you create that space for those collaborative, hands-on, experiential opportunities to happen. So it was a phenomenal program that really started using this idea of technology and how technology could really impact and change the way we teach and the whole pedagogy behind how we're running classrooms.
So on that note, do you feel like in the next 10, 15, 20 years that particularly now that so many of us are utilizing technology during COVID, do you see education as a whole transitioning from this sort of traditional everyone sitting at their desk and the teachers in front of the classroom lecturing to this more flipped classroom and utilizing, like you said, they can watch a video on their own and come to class ready to sort of explore and create?
Gosh, I hope so. I think we're going to miss a really golden opportunity if we don't change this. I had a great conversation when we were first closing down schools and moving to a digital classroom approach about this idea being an opportunity to be a real moonshot for education, to really fundamentally change the things that we look at. Now that every teacher has had this kind of experience, I'm going to talk mostly about North Carolina teachers because I know it is different in some parts of the country and some of the more rural aspects, but certainly in Wake County, that students now have access to technology. We've worked out how to get hotspots to kids who might need them, to make sure every kid's got a Chromebook if they need access to a device. Um, and we've discovered, I know that teachers have this facility with all of these different ways to engage student learners. We've discovered that there are some kids that actually have done much better in this format than they were doing in in-person learning, particularly maybe at the middle school level, but the social stresses of sitting in a classroom with other people, this worry that other people are looking at you, um, judging you based on what you're wearing, what's happening with that, the ability to respond by chat, using the chat feature. Suddenly we have kids that would never have raised their hand or called out in class are being way more engaged. The opportunity to build in what I love about digital teaching learning, you talk about like the 4 P's and a T's, right? It changes your pathway to getting the information that you need, the pace at which you can learn, the time that it's done. So not everyone has to be in the same physical space, the physical time, um, learning the exact same thing. You can create this more personalized program. You can create playlists of opportunities for kids to explore their own interests at their own time. The students who are ready to do more can go ahead and work on more. The students who need more support can get that additional support. So I certainly hope that there's some aspects of what we've learned about virtual instruction that can carry over into the classroom to really kind of change this model that still exists. And I know we struggled, when we first shut down the physical building, we struggled with not just moving our whole program now online, right? So you used to sit in the classroom and listen to the teacher. Now you're sitting in front of your screen and listening to the teacher, right? Exploris has always been more about how can we do less listening and more doing. So moving to the virtual environment to find more ways to do that as well. And now everyone's a lot more comfortable with so many of these tools, including our parents who were very often sitting next to the kids as they've navigated all of this. So yeah, I really hope we can take the best parts of what we've learned and use it to reach even more students and see even more growth.
I hope so as well. I think that would set students up much better for corporate America and lots of different fields that they might go into one day as adults. So you sort of mentioned the differences, and you said you were focusing on North Carolina. What we often hear about the ranking of our schools by state, What differences did you notice from the Northeast versus here in North Carolina with education?
Yeah. Well, this I don't want to get too much into a political viewpoint, but one of the biggest differences I noticed was North Carolina doesn't have the kind of a union program that New York has. So New York, the schools are run pretty much by your city. So the town that you live in each runs its own small school district, not by the county. And so there is some bit of a sense of you buy your house, you buy your school. So you'll see those kinds of discrepancies, and the unions that are there are able to organize contracts for the teachers that very often were also protective of the students. So it might have to do with class size, for example, but the union really helps support the teachers in crafting systems and programs that were going to be really effective for having really strong schools. When I moved south, it was very different to look at this county structure, to realize, as I said at the beginning, that Wake County has to just take something as simple as a snow day. You might have a very different situation going on in Fuquay-Varina than you have in Cary, and this county still has to make a decision for everybody that's based on that. And the buy your house, buy your school is a little bit less of an equity issue, because the county is using magnet schools and charter schools, which actually weren't as much of a thing when I first moved south, or even in New York, but have grown since then. So there are more opportunities for families to have access to an educational program that's going to best meet their own students and families' needs, and maybe even different kids in the same family going to different schools and different programs. So you have those bigger options that are there. So I think that was some of the differences. We're just looking at that shift in the decision making that might have gone from more of a teacher-based, smaller-based community to more of this county-based system that was looking at the needs of the entire county, as opposed to that smaller subset.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So, when we're thinking about students who are interested in pursuing a career in education, you mentioned them going in and observing and maybe even having an opportunity to give a lesson. What would you say in terms of skills that they may not get in an education program in college that they need to sort of be aware of trying to hone before becoming that classroom teacher?
Sure. I mean, we talk about the kind of academic side, and then sort of the soft skill side, right? So on the soft skill side, the things that really can't be taught, but they can be practiced, include this idea of empathy, of being able to understand the perspective of a parent who's angry about something, and that emotions run really high, that kids, as particularly as a school administrator, you tend to see people, when there's really when they've exhausted their other avenues, like their things aren't working with the teacher, things aren't working between teachers, things aren't working with a student. So being able to step back and to listen empathetically, to gather that evidence before you make a decision, to make sure you're hearing all perspectives, all different sides of the story. Those are things that are really important to have. I think some of the things that they don't necessarily train you for that are really useful are things you might not have thought about. I've often laughed, as I was 10 years as a yearbook advisor, and my time working as a yearbook advisor was actually been incredibly effective in using in being a principal. That idea of learning the whole school, because if you're running a yearbook, you have to know every club, every sport activity that's happening. You have to have that big wider lens that you can pull back and see the whole program. The communication piece on how you're going to make sure every student is represented, because yearbook goals are always to make sure that every kid is in the yearbook multiple times, not just in that one little square picture that they get. And just the graphic art part, to be able to do newsletters and communications, to write an email that's not, this long, to keep things short and sweet, writing a caption for a picture kind of thing, which was kind of surprising. And I know my yearbook, the company rep would love to hear that yearbook skills are great, a great job training for that. The other thing that's really helpful to have is some background in legal aspects. I often found that my time as a debate coach, because we dealt with so many of the legal issues and looked at cases that affect schools, legal cases, because a lot of times the debate topics will be drawn from things that have affected schools, gave me some fairly solid feedback when occasionally some legal things have happened, that I already had some of that foundation that wasn't taught explicitly in the administrative prep program, for example. So some surprising things that come out of your own experiences and interests that can actually be really beneficial on the job.
That's really, really cool. So that kind of leads me to another question about your position as a middle school, well, K through 8 administrator. What are some misconceptions that people might have about your sort of day in the life
Yeah.
job?
Well, the analogy is the duck, right? Swimming on the water and everything looks really smooth. But underneath the feet are, doing this like crazy. So I think in general, a lot of people think that they know what a job in education looks like because we've all been to school and we've been to school for years, right? You're in a building in kindergarten, you're in a school classroom through high school, and a lot of times you're in a school classroom all the way up and through college. And so you think I've sat in a lot of classrooms, so I understand how classrooms work. I've been to a lot of schools, I understand how schools work. But there really isn't, there's so much more behind the scenes that is going on with that people don't recognize. I think a lot of times people think that principals just deal with bad kids. And really, when I look at principals, I think the ideal principal is more that idea of the ship's captain that uses their staff really well. So a ship captain would never just decide on a course without consulting their navigator, right? Would never, would never, would never, make a decision about supplies without getting an inventory about what do we actually already have, what's on board. So I think that there's an awful lot of having the right people who are quality and know what they're doing around you, and then listening when they're giving you advice and telling you things. I think I hate the word, I shouldn't say I hate the word, but proactive, we use that too much. But when you have this idea of the principal is going to be somebody that's the office you get sent to when you've been bad. I think a really good school leader is going to be someone that has put things in place so that you're not getting kids arriving to you as the arbiter of the problem. You're empowering the teachers to be able to make the changes in the classroom so that they can solve those problems with the kids, so that they can have those systems and those communities and those relationships in place. And by the time I get a kid who comes to me, but I'll tell my staff sometimes, like, my job is not to just mete out the punishment. My job is not to go to the handbook and say, well, you broke this rule, so this is what's going in. But again, is to figure out what were the situations what were the background things that got us to the situation, and what are the steps we can make to make sure that we don't get to this situation again. And that may be, again, that idea of listening to all sides. So I think a lot of people don't recognize that building principals, again, are often responsible for the operation side. So I'll spend a fair amount of time on things like making sure the fire drills are all scheduled, setting up the inspections, working with the custodial contracts, maybe the less educator, less glamorous side of the job is dealing with those sorts of operational questions. But again, even if you're not the person doing them, you need to recognize the expertise of the people that you've got around you so that you can help make those final decisions.
So when a student is thinking about a career in education and they think about teaching, they think about administration, what might be some other um, fields in education that may not be as obvious?
Sure. So some of the things even that I considered before looking at, straight up school administration are things like curriculum design and instruction. So if you really love content and you really love the pedagogy of how you teach that, there are people who are experts in that and they help schools design their entire program. One of the jobs I did get to do when we opened Research Triangle High School was to found the English program. So what was English language arts going to look like as a 9 to 12 program? And we had some guidance from state standards that we knew we wanted kids to be able to meet, and some standardized tests and things that they were going to do. But beyond that, how are we going to design a program? What text do we want to use? What's the vision that we want to have? What's the scope and sequence of the skills that kids are going to have? So that idea of curriculum design and development is really great. There are educational consultants who help schools solve problems on a whole school level. We actually were working last year when I first came into Exploris was kind of going through some growing pains. And there were some questions about the climate of the school and the culture of the school, and some divisions between the elementary school portion and the middle school portion, some concerns about the leadership structure. And we brought in an outside consultant. So we worked with a group from NC State that works with school systems to look at what are the things that are impacting your culture, what are the goals that you have for the school, what are the best ways to design that. And so we actually looking at designing a very different kind of leadership structure that's a more distributed model. So less of this, I'm not an executive director. I am a middle school principal, and I'm also part of part of the leadership team that's guiding all of the decisions for the whole school. So we have teachers who are part of that team. So you have teacher voices that are brought into that. So if you're interested in education, but don't necessarily want to worry about, say, the custodial contracts of running a building, becoming an education consultant can be a great place to look at that. There's a lot of great opportunities in education research. I love some of the work that's done at the very early levels on literacy. How do kids acquire language and reading skills? Social aspects of this. I know like RTI does a lot of work at looking at the social impacts of programs. How can we make sure that the goals of the Leandro case are being met across the state? Are kids getting access to equal education? Or do they have barriers that are getting in the way of that, and how can we remove those barriers? So I think there's a lot of things if you like the challenges and the questions on what makes a good school and what makes a good teacher and what really does help a kid grow. There are lots of ways to still have a career based around those ideas without necessarily being a classroom teacher, a building principal, working on those day-to-day issues.
Very exciting. And
Yeah.
Crystal put in the chat there about how you have to have expertise in so many areas in your current role. And so I know we're approaching the hour mark, but I just wanted to see again for students who are thinking about entering into the field of education, any other advice you'd give them and what they can do now in terms of class selection, volunteer opportunities. You mentioned shadowing, but anything else you might give in way of advice?
So I think particularly if you're interested in administration, have in your mind a plan that you are going to spend some time as a classroom teacher, because it's really hard to manage a job that you've never done. And the best school leaders that I've worked with also had spent a fair amount of time being effective educators in a classroom setting as well. And probably the least effective school leaders I've worked with are people who might have spent maybe a year teaching and then immediately moved into the office. And they just kind of lose touch sometimes. I've had some people that I've worked with that are very good with that. But I would say as part of your career plan, do plan to teach. And I can't give you a magic number on that, but I would say at least a couple of solid years to get the arc of what several years of teaching looks like with that. I really recommend, like I said, if there's a future teachers program at your school, or find a teacher mentor who would help you start that kind of a club. That gives you the opportunity to, right now, there is actually a formal class that's offered in some schools that you can actually take that as a course and start learning about adolescent psychology and different approaches to early literacy, those kinds of issues, and gives you an opportunity to start teaching. But ask a teacher. I'm sure teachers, particularly in the digital world, ask if you can teach a class. Say, hey, can I, I'll read ahead on this chapter. I'll learn this particular skill. Can I lead this lesson? And I can't think of many teachers who would say, no, absolutely not. They might give you some parameters for that, but give it a try and see what it's like to try to craft a lesson plan, deliver it, figure out if you kept the kids' attention, assess your own effectiveness. And that'll sort of give you a taste for whether or not you absolutely love it or whether it really wasn't so much for me.
And might want to go into radio like your friend at grad school.
Yes. There might be ways to take some of those skills that you've learned and apply them in a different spot. Yes.
Right. Yes. And Crystal put in the chat about our peer tutoring center that we have through NC Virtual that really gives kids an opportunity to work one-on-one with students in that kind of capacity.
Yes, that's a great idea. And I know a number of like National Honor Societies will offer tutoring and things as well. Yeah.
So on sort of a personal note, before we adjourn today, my husband and I are both high school teachers, and my husband had done at least the classroom work to be an administrator, but then didn't end up doing the internship. He decided to stay in the classroom, and we often talk about the skills that might be different to be a classroom teacher versus an administrator. And how, like you said, if you have an administrator who hasn't been in the classroom, there seems to be a disconnect there between teachers. But just sort of, like I said, personally curious, what would you say about the different skill set between a classroom teacher and an administrator?
I think as a classroom teacher, and this is going to be a little broad. I think as a principal, to some extent, you need to have a thicker skin. So as I mentioned, lots of people are going to come to you when they're angry about something or when they're upset about something that's happened. And as a classroom teacher, you'll get that sometimes too. You get a kid that's having a bad day, or you get a parent that's mad over something that happened in class. But as a principal, that's one of the number one things that you are doing, is helping with that kind of conflict resolution. And you have to recognize, like we did with the um, shutdowns, that sometimes you're going to be making a really difficult decision, and you are not going to please everybody. You have to thread that needle between, yes, kids do better when they're in school, and parents and families need kids to be back in school. And yes, it's socially damaging to be alone and they're feeling isolated and all of that. And yes, this is, a contagious disease that hurts people. So what are going to be your guiding principles for making those decisions, and recognizing that these are two opposing truths, two opposing situations, and you're going to have to, you can't stay neutral. You're going to have to make a decision that's going to weigh one side or the other. And that means that some people may not be happy with you. I had a teacher, Eric Grundon, who was the founding leader at Research Triangle High School, said sometimes a principal's job is just to let people yell at you. It's like, they need to be heard, and they're upset about things, and that's your job, is to hear. But you don't necessarily have to fix that. And I think as a classroom teacher, I was always, always, always looking to fix it. I wanted that customer satisfaction. I wanted kids to do well. As a principal, my job is to keep the ship on course. And I may have some people that don't like that particular course, but am I keeping people safely in the boat, and are we making progress towards the goal that we're trying to get to? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Take a kind of angry input without response. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise and experiences with us today. It's been extremely interesting and informative.
Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing. I think, like I said, I want to avoid situations like my friend that gets all the way through a very expensive undergrad and master's program and then finds out that they're not in the right career, right? So this is a great time. All the students or things who are watching this, to go explore, to try things on, teach a couple classes, shadow a little bit, and then decide if this isn't good for you. Same for any career option that you're looking at, to get into seeing what the behind the scenes really looks like. And then that'll help figure out if this is the place that you want to spend a lot of time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us this morning.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And again, thanks for your work to get our kids ready to have a strong pathway from their high school and middle school learning into a career in North Carolina.
Yes, and exciting to see if many of our schools will go in the direction of the Research Triangle High School and Exploris School.
Very much.
Yes, well, thank you again. And as Crystal mentioned, this will be uploaded to the NCBE website, so it'll be archived for students to explore and find out all of the great information you've provided today.
Wonderful. Thanks again for your time this morning. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.